This album is dedicated.
Welcome to the Postgame. Michael Brooks here. Welcome new patrons with Professor Richard Wolff. Thank you for sticking around for the Postgame.
My pleasure.
Great to have you. Honor to have you with super producer Matt Leck, junior economist David Griscom. While the professor's here, you're the junior economist. You're normally the chief economist. While he's here, you're the junior economist. Who knows? Maybe you're Varoufakis and he's the head of the Troika. You know, there's a lot of different ways this could go. Although I do think I like the Lucchesi Gambino comparison myself, but
I like academic titles. When you're at the top of the pile, you're called a full professor, so that the people below you are empty professors. You know?
You're an empty professor. You hear that, David? That's incredible. Is it true that is it a real line that Henry Kissinger said that the battles in academia are so vicious because the stakes are so low?
Yeah, or never have so many people fought so hard for so little.
Is that really true?
Why? It's a very academia in which I have spent my entire adult life is a very, very sad place. It's a lot of people who spent many years going through the university to get that PhD degree and were made to feel all along the way that they probably weren't smart enough or maybe weren't smart enough. The damage done to your self-esteem is really serious. I mean, if psychologically sophisticated people looked at graduate training, they would have a lot of criticisms and suggestions for change because of the damage, the human damage that's done. Anyway, the result is that there's a tremendous level of insecurity and self-anxiety among academics, and little things that somehow trip that off can become enormously important. So, for example, most buildings at universities have corners. And if you have a building with a corner, it means you can have a corner office
Right.
or not a corner office.
This is a big one.
And the virtue of the corner office is it has windows on two sides, whereas most of the other offices have a window only on one side, making the corner office usually more desirable.
The recipe for disaster.
Yeah, you can see what's coming. So now, if you're important enough, if you're valuable enough,
Oh, my God.
if your merit is enough, well, then you get that one. And the person on either side of you hates your guts because they're in a single window. I mean, it's just... I have been present in faculty meetings at more than one institution where 40 and 50 and 60-year-old men and women were reduced to the equivalent of toddlers in an insufficiently large playbox, fighting over the sand truck with a bitterness that is, understandable if you're 3, but you should have gotten over it by the time you're 63. So
I remember going into my advisor's office at Bates. And I think, at Bates, you actually have to write an undergraduate thesis. So you do work with these professors pretty closely. And I won't say his name because it's not a flattering story. He was pretty nice to me, a very eccentric guy. But I walked in, and the door was open, and our appointment was, and he has his back to the door, and he's composing an email. And he's literally going, I won't fucking... He's ranting out the email as he types it. And I kind of did a little, and he said, oh, Michael, good, come in. He was literally in the middle of screaming. I was wondering who that email was going to. Let's start with a phone call because I see that you've been waiting on for a while. You're calling from a 760 area code. Is everything up so that Professor Wolff can hear it? You're calling from a 760 area code. Who are you? Where you're calling from? And what is your question or comment?
Hey, Michael, it's Kentucky Fried Comrade. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, good. How are you, brother? What's going on?
I'm pretty good. I've got one or two comments here. One, I'm really hoping you play... Look, if we're not going to see the bloodbath between Professor Wolff and David Griscom, I'm hoping you're going to at least play the videos so we can just see what happened beforehand.
Oh,
so everybody knows.
You should tweet out and ask for that because we can't find it. I think it was on the Trevor Beaulieu episode, but I don't... A time when Trevor was on, but I don't remember where that... I would like to play that clip very much. The stop motion of Professor Wolff, David Harvey, and Slavoj Žižek beating David Grishcom at a pool hall, like in Goodfellas. That is one of the funnier things I've ever seen in my life.
I've been looking for it. I've been looking for it myself. I can't find it, but all you TMBS heads out there, if you can find it and tweet it in or comment it
at
in.
Matt Leck.
Yeah,
quick.
at Matt Leck. I mean, look, let me just say I can't. I mean, David's been talking a bold game for a while. He comes in, he pusses out. I mean, that's not on me. He opened the door. He opened the door. I was in the middle of doing a segment. He opens the door. He goes, "Oh, hi, Mr. Wolff. How are you?" It's pathetic. Just totally unmanned.
I do have a nerd question for Professor Wolff. I actually got a chance to meet you. You were giving a speech in Berkeley. I think it was like 2014, 2015, something like that. I have a total nerd question for you. It's a theory question. I used to be a really big Marxist theory nerd. I've kind of backed off that. But what do you think about stuff like Andrew Kleeman writes about the temporal single system interpretation of Marxist theory of the rate of profit to fall? And I know it's a nerd question, but I'm just really curious about it. Thanks a lot, guys. Love you. Left is best.
Love
Bye.
you back. Left is best.
Well, let me answer it in a way that might make it interesting for lots of people.
Thank you.
The people who started modern economics, mostly Adam Smith and David Ricardo, were among many who were very fearful that the capitalist system, which they loved and which they celebrated as being much better than what it replaced, namely feudalism, had a flaw. And the flaw was that the rate of profit that was the driver of everything that happened, that made capitalists compete with one another, that drove capitalists to invent new and better ways of producing things, that it was the driving vital part of the system, that the system would drive the rate of profit down, that with more and more capitalists competing, they would have to compete by lowering the price. That would depress the profit, and eventually the profit would get so low that there wasn't an incentive for a capitalist to go into business because the rate of return was simply too low, and then they wouldn't do it, and then the system would kind of peter out. And they were terrified that this would happen. They saw the economic downturns that afflicted capitalism as happening periodically precisely because the rate of profit tended to fall, and that would threaten the survival of the system. So they went to great lengths to figure out what to do about this, whether there was something that could be done about it, what there could be. So Marx comes along. It's kind of interesting. After Smith and Ricardo are gone, Smith is dead, Ricardo dies in the early part of the 19th century. Marx reaches his maturity in the middle of the 19th century. Marx says, they had an idea. And what they understood was that there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And so Marx says, this is interesting to me. Unlike Smith and Ricardo, I don't see the end of capitalism as bad news. I see the end of capitalism as good news. That's going to get us to the next system, which is what we need. So I'm very interested. Does the system have a tendency for the rate of profit to fall such that it could be the end of the system? And so Marx devotes, and if you're interested, it's in the middle of Volume 3 of Capital, chapters, if I recall, 13, 14, and 15.
Did you know that,
Not
David?
to be too nerdy.
Did you know that, David?
But there Marx is his typical Hegelian self. The first chapter is called The Tendency for the Rate of Profit to Fall. The second chapter is called The Contradictions Within That Tendency. And the third chapter is called The Counter Tendencies. What can happen to undo that? Because Marx is a complicated thinker and doesn't think things are all in one direction. Things are complicated, like Hegel taught. Everything is contradictory. So it's a very rich set. They're not very long. They're
Relational, not
That's
linear.
right. Very relational, not linear. Good way of putting it. And he says, so there is a tendency, and it is a problem for capitalism, but capitalism has evolved a variety of ways of coping with it, which is in a way why it survived as long as it has, which is not to argue that it will never be the end of the system. It just means it's a question of the conditions and the counteracting factor. If you look at it that way, you end up being a bit open-minded about this mechanism, this tendency, and what it can or cannot do. And that sometimes runs you afoul of people who think in a different way. I'm going to try to be very polite. I know Andrew Kleiman, and I respect what he's trying to do.
Oh, yeah, here it comes.
But
I'm ready.
here we go. But
Dipset.
Marxists have always included people who want definitive answers. They don't want answers that are conditional, that are contradictory, that have counter tendencies. They want to know, okay, here it is, here's how it works, and here's where it goes. And so some people have always argued that the tendency for the rate of profit, if properly looked at and measured and understood, is the death knell of capitalism, and that's what we should study, and that's what we should do. Andrew's a bit more like that. I'm a little bit less like that. So I'm more of the conditional.
Then could you actually get us to, and David, you can jump in on this too if you want, where you fit in the Marxist tradition and tell us about Althusser? This seems like a good pivot point for that.
Sure. Well, I'm an American. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. It's as an American as you can get. And
oh, wow. I'm sorry. I apologize. Professor Wolff, can we play this clip before you explain that?
Sure.
We have found this. And I do want to say that in addition to David having a lot of talk, being all talk and no cattle, I think, as they say from where you come from in the country.
It's all hat and no
all
cattle,
hat,
but-
no, whatever the fuck. I don't care.
all hat, nothing
yeah,
else.
yeah, all hat. No, yeah. But that Professor Wolff, this is another part of you that I have not seen. This is what you guys inflicted on David Griscom here is brutal. This is from a couple of weeks ago. I think probably in Queens, I'm assuming.
See, I'm going to have nightmares about this.
I do
We have
like that
we have a
Zizek
very
is just watching in the background, ruminating.
I like that. Yeah, Zizek is just standing. So, how many guys have you and David Harvey jumped like that?
We only do that in Staten Island now.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please. You're American. You're born in Youngstown, Ohio.
So that means my introduction to Marxian theory happened in the United States context. And given my age and my life, here's roughly what that meant. In none of the schools I attended was Marxism or Marxian economics, but Marxism in general, taken seriously by anything more than a tiny handful of odd professors, some of whom I learned about, so I could take their classes, many of whom were so quiet or hidden about it that I never even found out. And just for the record, I went to what Americans consider good schools. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, then I went to Stanford for my master's degree in economics, and then I went to Yale, where I got another master's in economics, a master's in history, and a PhD in economics. So I'm a poster boy for elite education here in the United States. Nobody taught me Marxian economics, ever, in any of those schools, in any systematic way, with one exception. At Stanford, for the first semester of the two that I was there was a professor named Paul Baran, B-A-R-A-N, fairly famous. He taught us Marxian economics. But I was 10 years in Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, and I had one semester of one teacher who did that. All my others didn't. So for me to learn Marxian economics, I had to have a lot of interest, and I had to have time.
How did that interest start, may I ask?
It was my father. It was my father. I grew up in the town of New Rochelle. It's a suburb of New York.
In Westchester, yeah?
Yeah, Westchester, about half an hour from Manhattan. My father
Also, Puff Daddy's from New Rochelle.
and my father was a commuter, like so many. It's considered a bedroom community. You know, you have your family there, and you take the train into New York every day. And so I would go with my father. Occasionally, I'd go with him. And the train from Westchester is the what's now called Metro North. Mm-hmm. It goes through Harlem. Yep. And it's above ground at Harlem.
125th Street.
125th Street is a station it stops at. And in those days, Harlem was obviously black and Harlem was obviously poor. And the train gave you a kind of a bird's eye view into the apartments because they were very close to the tracks. And it was obvious to me, a little kid, 7 years old, 10 years old, with my father. And I remember asking him, who are those people? New Rochelle didn't have very many black people. Who are they? Would tell me about this. And my father would get a funny look in his face. And he would get serious in a way that I wasn't used to. So I could tell, this is important what Daddy is telling me. And I didn't get that much attention from my daddy. And this was important to him, so I was excited for the attention, And he explained to me, basically, that some people are excluded from a good life, a good job, a good income, and these are the people, and it isn't fair, and it is terrible for them, and it's not good for everybody else. And I heard this story repeatedly because I went in with my father, 5-10 times a year. And I think if I had to find a place where it all started, there. And my father would always, whatever he was doing, if we started talking about social issues like this, he would stop and pay attention to me in a way he didn't normally about anything else.
Right.
So I think there was an association between something I needed and wanted from my father and these conversations about society. By the time I got to college, I was already clear that I didn't think the way this society worked was very good.
Right.
And I wanted to get some criticism about it. And man, that was not the right time, and now those were not the right schools to get it. And so I did it on my own, and I discovered criticism. I found it. The libraries are full of it. And if you start to criticize the system and you begin to see, pretty soon you find Marxism, because in a way it is the biggest tradition. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Marx dies in 1883. That's 150 years, not even, from then to now. And Marxism has spread all over the world. Every country has Marxist parties, Marxist movements, Marxist governments in places like China, little country, things like that. So Marxism has spread unbelievably. And if you're interested in criticizing capitalism, you're going to find Marxism sooner or later. Mm-hmm. I did. I asked my father about it. He again told me that it's very taboo in this country. Be really careful. People get really weird when you talk about this. But you certainly should read it because it's a well-developed criticism, and that's what you're interested in. So I did. And I found my way to what were arguably the most sophisticated Marxist economists eventually. And the one that was the most important to me, two of them, one was a man named Paul Sweezy. Another one was a man named Harry Magdoff, both here in New York area. Paul Sweezy, actually a member of the Rockefeller family, but a radical, also went to Harvard, and translated Marx, learned German, by the way, translated Marx for the American audience, wrote it American versions of Marxian economics. The most important book was called The Theory of Capitalist Development, was used for many years, teaching courses all around the country. I met him. I got to know him. Same thing with Harry Magdoff. They produced a journal which still exists called the Monthly Review, publishes books in Marxian economics, still does to this day. By the way, the Monthly Review was founded in 1949 with money given for that purpose by Albert Einstein, who was a socialist and a Marxist and wanted this journal to get going, gave the money for Sweezy and Magdoff. So I became a kind of a student of theirs, unofficial. Everything had to be done, Saturday afternoon in somebody's living room or something, because the schools were useless to me. And so I kept my interest. I remember getting involved in struggles against the war in Vietnam in the 1960s when I was a student. And a kind of an epiphany happened for me in the late 1960s. I was finishing up at Yale, getting my PhD in economics. And I was called into the office of my macroeconomics professor, who we mentioned before, James Tobin. And Mr. Tobin, who knew me because our classes were small, so he would know the students, we knew him, and told me that I was damaging my career by my interest in Marxian economics and my interest in anti-Vietnam War activity, and that he wanted me to know. And by the way, he meant this as a friendly, good advice. He was not being mean or hostile.
Trying to help you out.
Yeah, he was trying to help me out and giving me this good advice to keep clear of this stuff. But he was talking to, by then it was too late, and all it made me do was get quite angry. I mean, I didn't show it to him. I was polite. I thanked him for his advice, because he meant well. There was no point in it. But it kind of confirmed on me, no, I'm going a different way. And it came to a head a year later when I had to decide, now I have my PhD, where do I go? I was offered a job at Johns Hopkins University, which is an Ivy League school, to teach economics. I was tempted. I went down there, gave a talk and all that. But I turned the job offer down because the City College of New York had just, this is 1969, declared open admissions. It was going to allow everybody, I think with a B average or better in the New York City school system, to come to college, which would open the opportunity for college to poor kids who would never have dreamed of going to college before. City College was free at that time. It was the only free school, I believe, in the United States. And I wanted to be a part of that, so I went to City College instead. I stayed there a few years, and then the University of Massachusetts in Amherst did something that many people don't know about, but it's really a wonderful story. 1973. They wanted to become the Berkeley of the East. The deans there told us that. And they said, the way we do that is we're going to hire radicals. And not just one. We're going to hire 5 of you at the same time. And they began with the most famous radical economics professor at that time, a man named Sam Bowles. I don't know if you know him, Samuel Bowles. An interesting fellow teaching at Harvard at the time. His father was Chester Bowles, who was the governor of Connecticut and a former U.S. ambassador to India, and a close friend of John F. Kennedy and part of his government. So it was a very establishment
very
fellow.
august name.
And Sam and I knew each other because, you know, it's a small group. If you go to Harvard and Yale and Stanford, everybody knows everybody else. It's the old boy network, we used to call it. Sam calls me up and says, sit down, Rick, you're not going to believe this. A school wants to hire radicals. That was already astonishing. And it wants to hire 5 of us, which is even more astonishing. And they have only one condition. Everybody has to come from Harvard or Yale. They're not willing to take any chance of hiring anybody else. So he gathered together 5 people, Sam, myself.
The most reactionary radical move ever.
3 others. And we all took the job.
Yep.
And at the tender age of, I believe I was 28 years old, we all by the way, we sat on one side of the table and the dean sat on the other. And we negotiated as a group. That never happens. Academia is a one person at a time gig. And we said, you hire all of us or you get none of us. By that time, we knew they wanted this.
Right.
So it was a little unfair because, you know, we knew. So we demanded everything. So, for example, I demanded tenure on the spot. No waiting, no testing, no nothing.
Yep.
So at 28 years of age, I got tenure. I demanded a letter saying I'm here to teach Marxian economics. They said to me, why do you want that? I said, I don't want some politician to come down the road from Boston at some point in the future and fire me because I'm not doing what I was hired. I want it listed. I'm hired to teach. So the end result was, for 35 years, I taught Marxian economics at the University of Massachusetts as a secure, tenured professor. And that, very, very rare in the United States, gave me an unparalleled opportunity. Because if you're a secure professor, you can actually learn what you're teaching. Because you don't know it beforehand. You go through graduate school, you're just beginning. When you stand up in front of a school classroom and you're just out of graduate school, you're not that far ahead of the students you're talking to, and a clever one of those students figures that out after a while. You have to really learn it. That takes time, that takes immersion, and you need the conditions for that. And I had them. And so I really learned. I studied the tradition, I read the Marx, I did all of the work because I could. And I was teaching it, so it was, you know, it wasn't a detraction, it wasn't time taken away.
And this led to Althusser.
Yes.
Who is
Because
Althusser?
I will tell you in a minute.
Please. Okay.
Here's my problem. A lot of Marxism got, I don't know, I'll be dramatic, hijacked. It got hijacked in the 20th century because people who were sincere Marxists undertook something that Marx himself had never undertaken. They undertook to make a revolution, and unlike Marx, they won. I mean, mostly the Russians in 1917. Right. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, all those guys. And now they had an altogether new problem. Not the problem of criticizing capitalism or overthrowing it. The problem of, now what are you going to do? You've pushed the others aside. You're going to create a socialist alternative. They had no idea what to do. Marx never wrote about how to do that. There's no Marx writing, here's how you do a socialist society. There's no recipe book, there's no manual, and there's not even the abstract theoretical, nothing. So they started, And not so surprisingly, they did some things that were wonderful and made perfect sense and were successful. And they did other things, as we all know, that were horrible. Stalin did horrible things. Others did horrible things too.
Did you see this new? I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just.
Yeah.
I saw some new scholarship, and I know very little about. I know more Soviet and Cold War foreign policy stuff post '60s, but there was some new scholarship emerging about Stalin, and it wasn't it wasn't an airbrushing. It wasn't in no way minimizing of his crimes, but the frame that was interesting to me was more that even some of these atrocities could be understood, not justified, but understood, not even just as as this guy's some horrible dictator or this is an innate feature of having a communist system, but actually that a group of people who are trying to figure out what you pointed to earlier of how do we actually keep this thing.
That's right.
And so there was a politics to it, not
Absolutely.
just purely this sort of murderous irrationality.
Yeah.
And
Even when you
it
have
was interesting.
even if you have a murderous, irrational leader, you always have to ask the question: why is he like that? And why did the people around him enable that? Why
Right.
did they support it? Then you immediately get the larger questions because
Right.
being crazy and vicious doesn't mean you're the country's leader. That has to be worked out.
Right.
Anyway,
It has to be worked out. I like that.
Anyway,
I can say like
yeah.
Stalin is like, look, I know I'm crazy and vicious, but we have other dynamics to work out here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as an American, partly, and as that generation, I didn't want to have anything to do with Stalinism. I wanted to say, okay, what happened here? What went wrong? How do we make sure that when you go beyond capitalism, you don't go into that dead end or you don't go into that? In other words, it wasn't just anti-Marxists who were critical of what happened in the Soviet Union. It was Marxists, too, who had a problem now. How do you explain this? How do you make sure that doesn't happen? And when I began to put that together with what I was learning, I became dissatisfied with a good bit of the Marxism that I was learning. It was too mechanical. It was too simple-minded. It didn't allow for evidence that I thought had to be taken into account, like what happened in the Soviet Union, parts of it, and so on. And so I began, like people do, to look around. Are there any Marxists around who are really good, who have a lot to teach me, but who are not caught in that mechanical way of thinking
Right.
that I don't want to be part of? That's a part of Marxism I don't want. Is there any other kind around? And that's, it's just the way it is that it happens in life. I discovered that there was one. I began reading and looking, and he had a funny French name, Louis, as they pronounce it in France, Louis. Althusser is how they pronounce it, Althusser. And not only was it intriguing to me, but it turned out that even though I speak French, my father was born in France, so I've spoken French all my life, it was being translated into English just as I was getting interested, particularly by a group in England called the New Left Review, a journal that still exists.
That still exists, yeah.
And they did all the initial translations, and this was the right thing for me. It was like the oasis in the desert. Here was a leading Marxist professor. By the way, he was the rector, it's called, of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. That's the highest prestige philosophy school you can be in. It would be imagine if we had an institution that was an amalgam of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. That would be it, the École Normale. And he was not only a professor there, but the rector of the
We
university.
have this on screen now. The
Yes.
reproduction of capitalism.
Yeah, the full PDF is available on libcom.org.
And so I couldn't get over. He was against mechanical Marxism, rejected it. He wanted to bring the contradiction analysis from Hegel into Marxism. He was attuned to this new intellectual ferment around ideas of postmodernism. That's what it was called later. And he thought there was something very important in that could be brought into Marxism to make it less mechanical and more nuanced. And it was exactly what I was looking for. So in my first sabbatical at UMass, where I was a professor, and speaking French, which of course helped, I found a way to get introduced to Althusser in Paris, and I went to Paris, and in the summer of 1979, I worked with him and told him about how interested we were in America. He didn't know that people in America even knew about his work. The French are quite insular
They're a little
often in
insular,
their
right.
cultural life. You know, in Paris, everybody knows what everybody else is doing, but beyond Paris, they barely know. He was a very warm guy, very willing to talk to me, and he really set me on a path of reading that kind of Marxism that he was doing, and I found it nothing short of liberational. It allowed me to stay with and explore a Marxism much more subtle, much more nuanced, which led then to a whole network of books that I have written rethinking the Marxian tradition. Indeed, I helped together with other people to start a magazine in 1988 called Rethinking Marxism, which is now a global journal, an academic journal, but it's devoted to precisely that, breaking out of the early Marxism of the 20th century, these early efforts to go beyond capitalism, which were mixtures of success and failure, Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, which shouldn't surprise anybody because the early efforts to go beyond feudalism to capitalism were also mixes of success and failure. It took a long time before you could get the kind of capitalism that could survive. And my guess is we will look back on the early experiments of Russia and China and Cuba and say, well, they learned some things of what to do and they learned some things of what not to do. And the future will build on what was learned and be more successful in the way that has happened in the past. And I think in that process, Althusser's rethinking of Marxism will be a crucial part of it.
David, what made you interested in Althusser?
Well, I started reading Althusser primarily in the question of ideology, which I feel like something that you're talking about a lot when you're talking about these older Marxists, right? It's like there's this tension in Marxism, especially in more older Marxism, of this determinism, right? Just right. Like Marx at the end of the Communist Manifesto, it's like working, people of the world to unite. And the question is like, it was like 100 years later, it's like, where are they? Why has it not happened? And Althusser really starts to try to deal with this question of ideology and really introduces this question that very much ties in a lot of other problematic in that it makes it more difficult to come up with an easy solution. Ideas into Marxism, primarily what's the role of the state, what's the role of education, and he talks specifically about why does society reproduce itself the same way over and over and over again. And it's reading through Althusser, you really get a better understanding of the question of ideology, but also of what Marx and Althusser mean when they talk about scientific concepts.
Is this good to put in dialogue with Gramsci?
Yes. It was dialogue. Althusser was heavily affected and influenced by Gramsci, by Lukács, by many of the earlier major thinkers, Rosa Luxemburg, others, and tried to synthesize out of that, just as he says, a much more nuanced. The old idea that the economy determines what Marxists call the superstructure,
base and superstructure,
politics and ideology. No, said Althusser, the ideology has its own effectivity, its own power. The ideology affects and shapes the economic just as the reverse happens, and you have to see this interplay. That's what dialectics means. A much richer way of thinking through, and so people like me and my colleague Stephen Resnick, with whom I wrote a lot of books, we try to take that into economics to show that even though we're economists, economic determinism is a mistake. Right. The economy doesn't shape the rest of society more than it is shaped by them. And the trick of understanding is to see how they interact. That has been a problem with many of the older Marxists who feel as though they're losing something that they want to hold on to because of the economics. For us, Marx's focus on economics is not because it's more important than other things. It's a focus because other people undervalued it, he was going to talk a lot about it to correct the imbalance, but not to counterpose to the dominance of other things, the dominance of economics. He wanted to break that contest and talk about the interaction as how you understand what's going on.
That's funny, yeah. I remember because when I studied capital in college, I had the concept Marx in my head was a very linear mechanical thing.
Right.
And then when you actually, first when you read Capital, it was completely indecipherable. But then when you actually got some progress with it, it was like, oh, that's a reference to like Frankenstein. And that, like, this is actually literature and poetry and philosophy. And there's great intuitive breakthroughs, like my wages actually conceal my time being stolen, which I loved. That was my big takeaway.
Yes.
And then, but then there was also just a lot of ambiguity and a lot of difficulty and a lot of like, well, this reframes how I look at the world, but okay. And then what made it amazing was that I could, even in my own, incredibly rudimentary way, look at, well, what about Starbucks or what about, Apple or whatever. It's like, oh, this still makes sense. The enclosure of the commons, creating a market, all of this stuff, it's here.
Right.
It's alive.
And the beauty, I've enjoyed, just on a very human basis, I'm teaching capital, basically, in the class I teach at the New School right now. Every Monday, I teach my course there. And I love teaching Marx, precisely because, unlike so many economists, he really was a European intellectual of his time. The Capital is full of quotations from Shakespeare, from Dante, from the ancient Greeks. Marx got his PhD in ancient Greek philosophy. I mean, he knew all of the great Greek thinkers the way European educated people did, and it's full of humor and irony and sarcasm. I mean, it's much better reading than 99% of what has been forced down my throat as an economics professor.
Do you think Jordan Peterson misses some of this?
It's sad. Can I tell you a story about Jordan
Please.
Peterson?
I would love to hear a story about the weeping professor.
You know that there was recently a conference.
We were both there.
Right.
Indeed.
In the booming metropolis of Boise, Idaho.
Much love to Boise.
Yes.
Boise DSA. And Andrew.
And Boise, that's right. And yes. Boise State University hosted this. And originally when I got called, I don't know how they contacted you, Michael, but when they called me, it was to invite me to debate Jordan Peterson. And now I have to be very honest and tell you that when they invited me, I had no idea who that was. And I never
What a better mental ecology you have.
It just... So I did what all good Americans do. I went right to my Google and looked up Jordan Peterson. And, I'm not competent, as I've said, to talk about the psychology that he does. I'm married to a psychologist. She has taught me many things. But, it's not my thing. But occasionally he would veer off of whatever he was talking about, how young men should pull themselves up by whatever it is they pull. Yeah, I have to be careful. Anyway, when he does that, he veers off and talks about Marxism suddenly.
Right.
It kind of erupts into his discourse. And then he has a simple equation: Marxism, Stalin.
Right.
Marxism equals Stalin. Stalin is awful. Therefore, it's a mystery to him, he says this, why anybody who isn't perverted would be interested in Marxism, since it equals Stalin, which equals murder, or something like that. And, I'm dumbfounded. I mean, I know this was hot stuff in the 50s and 60s at the height of the Cold War. This sort of reasoning passed in a society that was so hysterically frightened about something that it worked at that level of sophistication. But that has all died out. The Cold War isn't here, and that level of Cold War discourse, I thought, had faded with it. Good riddance. But not with Jordan Peterson. He must have discovered it, I don't know, early last week, and it's very exciting to him. It's new, it's fresh, and he deals with it as if he just figured it out, and is helping us all to recognize this colossal insight he had after one beer. So
One cider.
so I said, okay, this is going to be kind of easy. This is sort of childish stuff, and I will say that because
It is.
what are you going to say? and then, so I agreed. I agreed to do the debate. I did eventually go out there when we met there.
You gave a great talk. You spoke about Jordan Peterson
yes,
for
I
about
did.
5 minutes.
Yes.
And then you went
Because
on to
several
more important
weeks,
things.
several
Yes.
weeks after I accepted, which was I think during the summertime or something like that, I got called back by them, and they told me that the debate was off because Mr. Peterson had, I believe, if I understood the story correctly, increased his fee and quite considerably, and so the university couldn't do that. It's a state university, so they can't do that. And so the debate was off. And clearly the young people who called me were, let me be polite, agitated by this course of events, and so invited me to come out by my lonesome and give a talk in place of the debate that was now off. But Jordan Peterson, whatever his qualifications as a psychologist may be, I don't know. But when it comes to Marxism, this is the worst, silly, dismissive caricature that I've seen in many a year. Used to be common,
Right.
but nowadays people, the kind of people who used to do that easily, they know somehow that doesn't fly anymore, and so they don't do it. But
Kind of embarrassing.
Mr. Peterson, he doesn't get it, so he runs it up the flagpole and hopes.
I understand why those students were upset because, I mean, not to rag on Idaho because, you know, the Boise Broncos have an interesting football team, but you debating Jordan Peterson would have been probably the most amazing thing that's happened
I
in
don't
that
know.
state
That
all
would be
year.
like-
That would be the number one event, I think.
I feel like it would be like I can't think of the proper analogy.
Peterson would have been embarrassed.
Peterson would have been totally embarrassed.
I don't
but
know.
his
The
cult-
people who
his
talk
cult
like
would have
that-
yeah.
The people who talk like that, I mean, I hope so. That would be good.
No,
if
he
you were
wouldn't be
embarrassed,
but
I
there
don't-
would be a good general public.
He
viewing.
wouldn't have
Remember.
he wouldn't have been able to keep up on
Yeah,
economics.
he wouldn't have
No.
been able to keep up on anything other than
But you know, to be fair to the guy, and I don't know him, so it's not that I'm trying to be nice. I was struck, honestly, by how seriously many of those young people in the audience had obviously taken his work. That they had been reading and watching videos of Jordan Peterson. He's getting their attention.
He certainly. Well, I think he's
They made a
speaking very
conference.
well to alienation in
I
a
think-
very powerful way.
I think that, and also I was talking to my friend about this over the Thanksgiving break. You know, like the church has always played such a large role in, like, especially American society, and sort of like alleviating a lot of people's personal feelings of alienation. And more with younger people being more and more secular, I feel like he's found that role. Where, if you look at his message, and he is, you know, religious, right? But
Yeah.
he's not giving a sermon per se. And a lot of those people who are Jordan Peterson fans, also like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and all these new atheists, as contradictory as it is, right? For a completely irrational thinker like Peterson, who talks about dragons and stuff. But like he really is trying to fill in that void of, you know, a secular church in a lot of ways.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Let's take a few more calls. We have to go soon, but we're going to take. I'm sorry, I apologize. Cannot get to all of you, but we're going to take some Discord questions and some calls. You're calling from a 330 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? And what is your question for Professor Wolff?
Hey, it's Ryan from Ohio.
Hey, Ryan, what's going on?
First of all, I want to give a shout out to Cliff Schechter for doing such a great job here in Ohio and helping us take back the governor's mansion. But
This is an
sorry.
interesting, petty
but-
insult. You don't have to worry about this, Professor. Part of the broader universe that I am a part of, and Cliff Schechter gets a lot of heat. The only thing I'll say about Cliff Schechter is not a Marxist. All right, yeah.
Well, I actually want to talk about the GM shutdowns. I live about 45 minutes from Lordstown, where one of the biggest plants is being idled. And basically, like, everybody around here knows somebody who worked there. Like, my grandpa worked there for like at least 20 years before he retired. But basically, you can like tie this into like why Ohio remains a red state. Really, it's kind of ironic. Like, the state just keeps getting poorer and poorer, and nobody in the Democratic Party seems to know how to talk to this state at all. And
except for, I mean, obviously he's no radical, but even Sherrod Brown, just having the bare minimum of concern for labor issues, does pretty well. That should say something.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Sherrod Brown overperformed like every Dem in this state. I mean, Cordray. The most common ad I saw for Cordray. I don't know. I think it's been like scrubbed from the internet, but was literally just Obama singing Al Green.
Really? They really ran that ad?
Yeah, and then they ran an ad. It was just Obama singing Al Green, and then they're like, "Hey, Cordray knows Obama. Vote for Richard Cordray."
I'm friends with this devil.
And
I'm friends with this little goofy Yakub. Car jobs? Psych. Allahu Akbar. Well,
but
that's
I
incredible.
just wanted to share that because Ohio seems like the most vexing state of this past election. So maybe I'd help shed a little light on it.
Well, is Ohio, based off of what you said earlier, is Ohio the canary in the coal mine of American capitalism?
Well, I don't know if it's a canary, but it's certainly emblematic of what's happening in a large part of the country. The Democrats, sit there trying to hold on to their historical mantle as working people's party, but they don't do anything about this. They demonstrate to the mass of working people that either they can't, they don't have the strength to do anything, or they won't. And either way, there's not much reason to vote for them. And so you drop out, you don't vote at all, which, let's remember, most Americans do that. Or you get angry, you get bitter, the hypocrisy of wanting the Working People's Party, to getting that name without doing anything for it. So in their anger, they react and vote for Trump or somebody else who at least makes the theater. He called Mary Barra and he was tough with her. Okay, I mean, this is the cheapest lip service imaginable, but it's something. And I can see a worker saying, okay, I hear that. I understand there's not much there, but I don't even get that from the Democrats.
And there's all this bigotry. I mean, like Bill Fletcher Jr. always says, he says that fascism is the herpes of capitalism.
Yeah.
So the rising, bigotry and
I think
exploitation of those issues as well.
And fascistically oriented people, white supremacists, stuff like that,
Right.
They see this as an opportunity. They can point their finger at the usual devil they always point to, and they can get an audience now because the people are angry, looking for who's the bad guy. And if this is the only message they get that makes any sense, well, a certain number of them are gonna fall for that. The same thing with the immigrants. This immigrant country is all bent out of shape about immigrants.
A handful of people from Honduras.
Yes, I mean, it's just,
You're calling from a 226 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Michael, it's Albert from Canada.
Hey, Albert, what's going on?
Not too much. I just had a couple of questions for the professor. First of all, I'm looking real forward to you slapping up Grisham later. Really looking forward to that. My first question, though, seriously,
I love it.
is also about the GM closures. The Jerry Diaz, the president of Unifor, talked to Trudeau today, and we've had a whole bunch of politicians talking about it. And the discussion is always about like paying the company and working the company instead of doing something like what Corbyn suggested and loaning the money to the workers, to the union, to buy the company. Right. And then, Trudeau could do something which he loves in a free market solution to the electric car problem and get this plant pumping out electric cars, subsidize them to Canadians. But that's never the conversation. How do we bring that into the conversation? Or is it like what you said earlier, and the only route is the Castro route.
Thanks, Albert. Appreciate the call.
The
The only route is the what? Is the cash bailout? Bailout? Is that what you said?
Castro route. Like
Oh,
what
the
you guys are
Castro
saying,
route.
like,
So the only route is the Castro route. Thank you, Albert. Well, Mr.
Well,
Castro
I
showed us the way.
I love the point. I mean, why is that not part of the conversation? You know, the second biggest party in England is making that part of the conversation.
Right.
What's the matter with Mr. Trudeau? What's the matter with the union leader? Why isn't that presented? Why isn't that offered as something people could vote about or state their views about or be polled about? And there are a whole lot of other solutions. Look, there's a strong sentiment among labor unions in Canada and in the United States that the real purpose of all of these announcements isn't really about the plants closing. They're about to sit down in the weeks ahead with the unions to negotiate the next contract. And this is a ploy to scare the pants off those unions. You better give us concessions, except wage cuts or benefit cuts or security, or else, and then they'll make a grand gesture, we won't close the plant. See, we're giving up something. You now have to give us back your health coverage, or your this, or your that. These are quite well-paid workers, most of them. They've been around a long time, so they have a good bit to give back. And you could see a whole theater being developed because you're allowing this game to be played. You're allowing corporations, they do it all the time, to threaten. You must give us something, or we'll take away something from you, or we'll give it to some other person. That's the game that Amazon played with New York and Virginia. I'm going to give somebody a benefit. You better give me as much. You can compete.
I'm going to clog somebody's public transportation system and steal their tax dollars. It better be you.
Look at the spectacle of every major city and state
Right.
begging on its knees so this company can choose who will give them the biggest subsidies, who will give them the biggest tax breaks. This is
What
a
did we
race
say?
to
It was
the
like
bottom.
feudalism meets The Bachelorette or something. It was the most bizarre, embarrassing things. Oh,
Crazy stuff. And
grotesque.
And you're right. But the only way to deal with this at this point, the only way to deal with this is to make the biggest possible public movement that demands these other options be put on the table, exactly as you say, that goes after the prime minister, makes him suffer in terms of his political popularity, because he either has to take these notions and talk about them or look really bad for refusing to consider them. Either way, it's a step forward. And spreading the word that Corbyn, in a way, has already provided half the answer, and why are you not listening, is a good way to go after him. He wants to be popular and to be around in Canadian politics a long time. He cannot afford to pretend this isn't there.
Final call, then we have a few Discord questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all calls, but you're calling from a 407 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? What's your question for Professor Wolff?
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I'm the Brazilian from New Jersey.
Hey, Rodrigo. How you doing? Rodrigo, the Brazilian from New Jersey.
Pretty good. I've ingested the election results, been formulating what to do with family members that have gone full fash. But I actually called in to make just two quick statements and one more elongated question. The first statement, a caller last week on Majority Report mentioned Brazil and said something along the lines that, like, the way that democracy transitions in Brazil is that Brazil always kept the junta alive and well so that it could always just, as a precaution to power. And while this is kind of true, it also takes away the extensive process of redemocratization that literally the left went through this entire time in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And it's not that the Brazilian military has zero power or doesn't have power, but it's that they are still heavily, while there is a full fascist movement growing in Brazil, they are still heavily these trends that the working class doesn't want a police officer banging into their home if they post something bad on the internet. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And I'll skip the second quick statement. I'll just go into the question. when the real was being made in Brazil with Fernando Henrique and Meireles and Ciro Gomes, Fernando Henrique was still a socialist, or at least a social democrat at that point, and the real kind of reads like a socialist currency. It's dependent on the dollar. It has this function of bringing in two different states to work together to commodify each other in terms of facilitating trade. And what ended up happening in Brazil is that capitalism just took this road of what is the fastest way we can make money off the real and just invested into the commodities market, full stop. And obviously, Brazil's commodities market crashed. The real crashed along with it. Austerity was implemented, and Brazil is now in the state that it is. My question is more along the lines of when an international left project is being talked of, we kind of get into the problems of currency and international worker standards. And what do you think would an international left vision be to address the problems that we saw in Brazil with these types of things?
Well, yeah.
Very quickly.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
The problem for Brazil is like the problem for many other countries. If you accept the rules of the game, that is the basic rule of capital privately owned, searching for the most profitable investment, you will get one kind of economic development. It will be very successful if you're the only one playing this game in a feudal background. That's why England became the ruler of the world, even though it's a cold, wet little island off the coast of Europe. It became a global empire because if you're the first one on the block, you get a lot of benefits out of capitalism. If you're the second and third one, you have to defend yourself against the first one. Big struggles by Germany and the United States against Britain. That's why they used high tariffs, much higher than today, and many other protections. But if you're the last ones to come to this party, namely the so-called third world, after capitalism has become dominant in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, you have to provide even greater protections, or else you're always the last one at the party. You're always investing too much in the commodities to be sold to the places where capitalism is thriving. It turns out, ironically, that the countries that cut themselves off, either voluntarily or it was forced on them, like China after its revolution, had, ironically, the space within which to put private profit considerations aside and build a modern, balanced, diversified economy. If you don't take a comparable step, Brazil will always be the tail wagged by the dog of wherever capitalism has developed further. It used to be North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Now it's increasingly China and India.
And this relates, because I'm going to do a few questions from the Discord before we go, but Professor Wolff, could you talk about the international division of labor, the role the Central Powers expect from different nations? This is also from a Brazilian, e.g., Brazil in the global capitalist economy. Brazil's been deindustrializing since the mid-1980s at an accelerated speed.
Yeah, it wants the developed capitalist world wants a place to invest profitably, to produce goods and services that either no longer compete with those in the Western developed world or have replaced those. So if the Brazilians can figure out how to produce what Western Europe, North America, Japan, and China and India want, then Brazil will be able to do okay. The only alternative is for Brazil to break out of that system, have a completely different organization to build an economy that will be successful whether or not those other parts of the world assign it some role in an international division of labor. At least until you have the kind of revolution against those systems in the advanced part of the world, when there might be a much more equitable division. Until that time, you have to break out or you're lost. I mean, let's be real honest. Capitalism has produced unspeakable uneven development. It's an old idea of Marx's. Capitalism does not develop places equally. Downtown Manhattan is rich, and the South Bronx is a disaster. Much of the state of Maine is a disaster 10 miles away from the coast where the richest Americans have lovely homes, and on and on and on. This is a system that doesn't produce balanced development. And if you're in a poor area, you're going to be the one with the short end of that stick so long as you play by the rules of a game that produces. And even if you get some development in Brazil, the way, for example, India has in the last few years, you will find that the level of inequality inside the country actually gets worse, even when the country as a whole is less poor than the rest of the world. So you get this bizarre capitalism which has reduced inequality between nations while it's increased it inside of them.
Final question, because we do need to go soon. But I want to ask from Banerjee. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the Discord questions. I apologize, including. We'll talk about the Big 12 title lane with Griscom soon.
Well,
But
that's
this
on
question-
Saturday.
yeah.
Texas is going to beat Oklahoma.
Okay.
Texas is back, baby. Sam Ellinger's coming for the Heisman. There we go. Hook 'em.
I got you. All right. Question from Banerjee. My question is for Professor Wolff. Yanis Varoufakis calls the Eurozone a Hotel California situation, where once a country has adopted the euro as a currency, one cannot leave. With the Troika doubling down on austerity, how is it possible for Mr. Varoufakis to achieve the Green New Deal for Europe while being chained to the terrible euro currency? Isn't it better to ditch the currency despite the short-term pains it will cause? Can I just start by saying Mr. Castro showed us the way? But go ahead, Professor Wolff.
Well, I don't think Mr. Varoufakis, whom I know a little bit, is all that committed to a single currency. Yeah, he may stay with it for a while if it suits the broader objectives he has, but I think his goal is what I referred to a minute ago, a radical reorganization of the whole European economy to give it the kind of balance in its growth that it has never had. You go from the extraordinary wealth in large parts of Northern Europe to the extraordinary absence of that kind of wealth in large parts of Southern Europe, the same between West and East, and then the same inequality inside. France is a rich country, but the gaps in rich and poor in France are stunning if you know about them. If you travel from the slums of Marseille to the elegant arrondissement of Paris, it could not be more stark in the difference. So I think his goal is if you like, a Green New Deal, but a radical reorganization of the European economy. And his goal is based on the premise that as capitalism, and I think this is a valid premise, that as capitalism has a harder and harder time sustaining the mass of people in the parts of the world it is abandoning, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, slowly but surely the appeal of what Mr. Varoufakis is talking about will grow. The only real question is, will it grow faster or slower than the scapegoating of immigrants and alternatives that are trying to make hay out of the same decline of capitalism?
I also want to just add before we go, Fat Tire, worker-owned beer. We've been enjoying this evening.
The new
Thank you for
semi-official
bringing
beer.
Semi-official beer of TMBS. Professor Wolff, will you come do this with us again?
Absolutely.
We would love to have you on as much as possible.
It's a short subway ride. Couldn't be easier.
Excellent. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you to super producer Matt Leck, junior economist David Griscom, super producer David Slavic, each and every one of you. This Sunday, an illicit history of logic. Ben Burgess. See you on Sunday.